The world tilted violently as the officer grabbed Dina by the shoulders and spun her around. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, her back slamming hard against the rough asphalt. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as her vision blurred for a split second. Above her, the officer loomed, and for the first time that night, real fear sank in. He was out of control now. He didn't care about consequences anymore. He only cared about one thing: dominance. Her hands twitched, fingers closing around her phone, gripping it tight, ignoring the pain in her bruised limbs. Then, with one last desperate act, she pressed the call button. The screen lit up. A name appeared. Dad. Her last hope. Her voice was weak, broken, but she managed to speak. And on the other end of the line, someone answered. Dina lay on the ground, her breath ragged, her body aching from the rough treatment she had endured. The cold asphalt beneath her felt solid, unmoving, but her world had shifted into chaos. Her fingers clenched tightly around her phone, the screen casting a faint glow against her palm. The call had gone through, she had spoken, and now there was only silence on the other end. The officer above her didn't notice. His heavy boot pressed against her ribs, pinning her down. His eyes gleamed with unchecked arrogance, a predator savoring his dominance over his prey. He had her, or so he thought. The moment stretched, thick with anticipation. Then the atmosphere changed. A shift so subtle, so profound, it was almost imperceptible at first, but Dina felt it in the air. Something had altered the weight of the officer's presence, which had seemed absolute. It was suddenly challenged by something greater. A sound cut through the quiet, not the distant wail of sirens, not the hum of traffic, but footsteps. Deliberate, measured, unhurried. Heavy boots against pavement, each step carrying the weight of unshakable resolve. The officer noticed it, too. His posture stiffened slightly, his head tilting as if his instincts, long dulled by arrogance, were trying to warn him. But he ignored it, dismissing the noise as just another passing stranger. Dina, however, knew better. She forced herself to turn her head, her vision still blurred from pain, but her mind sharpening with something new: hope. From the darkness beyond the flickering streetlights, a figure emerged. Tall, solid, radiating an aura so intense that even the city itself seemed to pause. The officer's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Then he straightened, puffing out his chest, and turned to face the approaching figure. He had faced challengers before. He knew how to handle them. But this was different, because the man stepping into the light wasn't just anyone. It was Chuck Norris. Dina saw him clearly now, and despite everything, the pain, the exhaustion, the overwhelming fear, she felt something shift inside her, a relief so profound it nearly brought her to tears. Chuck's expression was unreadable, his eyes dark, scanning the scene with the precision of a man who had seen far too much injustice in his lifetime. He took in Dina's battered state, the blood staining her scraped knees, the bruises forming on her wrists. His jaw tightened. The officer, still standing over Dina, scoffed. He didn't recognize Chuck immediately, or if he did, he refused to acknowledge it. That would be his first mistake. Chuck stopped a few feet away, hands resting at his sides, utterly calm. The air between them was charged, a silent battle waged in a single glance. The officer, sensing the shift, decided to take control of the situation. He barked out something, likely an attempt to assert authority. But Chuck didn't react. He simply stood there, his presence alone more powerful than any badge or uniform. Then he took a step forward, and the officer, without realizing it, took a step back. A primal reaction, instinctive, the body recognizing a threat before the mind could rationalize it. Dina saw it. She saw the fear creeping into the officer's stance, saw his bravado waver just slightly. Chuck's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, low, controlled. But behind that control was something dangerous, something unstoppable. The officer hesitated, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He reached for his baton, fingers tightening around the handle, ready to remind this stranger who was in charge. That would be his second mistake because Chuck Norris was faster. The moment the baton was halfway from its holster, Chuck moved. A blur of motion, effortless, precise, lethal. The officer barely registered what had happened before his arm was twisted, The baton ripped from his grasp and tossed aside like a meaningless toy. A sharp, calculated twist sent pain shooting through his wrist, forcing him to his knees with a grunt. Chuck didn't even break a sweat. The officer gasped, shock replacing arrogance. He had underestimated the wrong man. Dina watched, breathless, as Chuck released his grip, letting the officer stumble backward. But he wasn't done. Not yet. The officer, despite the pain, made one last desperate move, reaching for the gun at his hip. That would be his third and final mistake. Chuck's next move was so fast, so impossibly swift, that Dina barely saw it happen. 1 second, the officer's hand was on his gun. The next, he was flat on his back, winded, disarmed, and staring up at the sky in pure disbelief. His gun was now in Chuck Norris's hand. Chuck examined it for a second, then casually ejected the magazine, letting it drop to the ground. The gun followed a moment later, sliding away across the pavement. The officer coughed, scrambling to sit up. His confidence had shattered, completely replaced by something raw and uncertain. Chuck loomed over him, expression still unreadable. Then, for the first time that night, Dina heard fear in the officer's voice, a stammered protest, an attempt to justify. Chuck didn't react. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Dina. The moment their eyes met, she felt an overwhelming wave of security. He crouched beside her, his movements surprisingly gentle, checking her injuries. She winced as he examined her scraped knee, but she didn't pull away. His presence alone was enough to make her feel safe again. Satisfied that she was still conscious and breathing, he stood. Sirens pierced the night. Getting closer. More officers. Chuck didn't move. The officer on the ground struggled to his feet, looking desperate, as if trying to decide whether to run or fight. Neither option would save him. As the patrol cars screeched to a halt, red and blue lights flashing, Chuck stepped back, allowing the unfolding chaos to take its course. The other officers jumped out, guns drawn, but the sight before them made them freeze. Their colleague, disarmed, a young woman, battered and bleeding, and Chuck Norris, standing there like an immovable force of nature. The tension lasted mere seconds before one of the higher-ranking officers barked an order. "Drop your weapon." Chuck merely gestured toward the gun lying harmlessly on the pavement. The officer nearest to the downed man quickly assessed the situation, his face darkening as he took in Dina's condition. Then, without hesitation, he ordered the arrest of his own officer. The fallen man protested, his voice rising in desperation, but no one listened. The cuffs that had been meant for Dina now snapped around his own wrists. Justice, in its purest form. Dina let out a shaky breath. Chuck turned back to her. He didn't need to say anything. She understood. She was safe now. Because Chuck Norris had arrived. The red and blue lights bathed the street in an eerie, pulsating glow, casting long, shifting shadows across the pavement. The wail of sirens was deafening, but to Dina, it felt distant, like white noise, muffled beneath the pounding of her own heartbeat. Her body ached, bruises forming beneath her skin, her scraped knees still stinging from the rough asphalt. But none of that mattered now. She was no longer alone. Chuck Norris stood beside her, a figure of absolute, unshakable authority. The moment he had arrived, the tide had shifted. The fear, the helplessness. It had all been replaced by something else, something powerful. Justice. The corrupt officer, no longer the unchallenged predator he had been minutes ago, lay sprawled on the pavement, his hands shaking as he cradled his wrist, still in pain from Chuck's earlier counterattack. His uniform, once a symbol of control, now seemed to hang limply on his frame, like a disguise that no longer fit. The arrogance was gone, the certainty was shattered. He had made too many mistakes, and now he was paying for them. The other officers who had arrived on the scene hesitated, their hands still hovering over their holstered weapons as they took in the situation. The sight before them was not what they had expected. Instead of an officer in control and a supposed suspect detained, they saw something far different. One of their own, disarmed, defeated, and undeniably guilty. The highest-ranking officer, a man whose hardened features showed years of experience, stepped forward. His gaze swept over Dina, taking in her injuries, the ripped fabric of her clothes, the scraped skin on her hands and knees. His expression darkened. Then his eyes shifted to Chuck Norris. There was a brief pause, one that carried the weight of unspoken understanding. This was no ordinary civilian standing before them. This was Chuck Norris, and his presence alone spoke louder than any words could. Chuck didn't move. He didn't have to. The corrupt officer scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for support among his colleagues, but none of them came to his defense. He took a step back, then another, his panic growing. "Take his badge," the captain ordered, his voice calm but firm. The words hit the officer like a physical blow. His badge, his authority, his power, gone. One of the other officers stepped forward hesitantly, reaching for the badge pinned to the disgraced man's chest. For a split second, it seemed like he would resist, his jaw clenched, his fists trembling at his sides. But then his gaze flickered back to Chuck, and whatever defiance had been left in him crumbled. He let the officer remove the badge, his body sagging slightly, as though the weight of his own guilt had finally settled on his shoulders. "Your weapon," the captain continued. The disgraced officer hesitated again, then slowly reached for his holster. His hands were shaking as he unfastened the strap, pulling out his gun and holding it out. It was taken from him without ceremony. The final piece of his authority stripped away. The cuffs came next. Click. The sound of the metal locking into place echoed through the street. The officer who had once held all the power, who had laughed as he pushed Dina to the ground, who had taunted her, humiliated her, hurt her, was now the one being restrained. His eyes darted back to Chuck, desperate, pleading, but there was no mercy there, no sympathy, only silent, unwavering judgment. Chuck stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The officer stiffened instinctively, flinching as if expecting another strike. But Chuck didn't raise a hand. He didn't need to. "You made a choice." Chuck's voice was low, measured, a storm beneath the surface. The officer's breath hitched. "You chose to abuse your power," Chuck continued, his words cutting through the night like steel. "You thought no one would stop you." The silence stretched, heavy and damning. The officer swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He lowered his gaze, unable to meet Chuck's stare any longer. Two officers grabbed him by the arms, leading him toward one of the waiting patrol cars. He didn't resist. He knew it was over. As the car door slammed shut behind him, Dina let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was done. He was done. For the first time since that nightmare had begun, she felt the weight lifting from her chest. She turned her head slightly, looking up at Chuck. He was still watching the patrol car, his expression unreadable, his fists still clenched, his stance still tense, as if he was making absolutely sure that justice had been served. Only when the car began to pull away did he relax. Then he looked at her. Their eyes met, and for the first time since this had all begun, she felt safe. Chuck took a step toward her, lowering his voice. "Are you hurt?" She hesitated, then nodded slightly. "A little." That was an understatement. But Chuck knew that. He could see it. Without another word, he placed a hand on her shoulder, not in the way the officer had, not with force or control, but with quiet reassurance, a simple grounding gesture. Dina closed her eyes for a brief second, letting that feeling sink in. She was safe. She was alive. And thanks to Chuck Norris, she had won, but there was still one last thing left to do. Go home. Together, they turned away from the flashing lights, the echoes of sirens, the weight of everything that had happened. Justice had been served. Now, it was time to heal. The sirens faded into the distance, swallowed by the city's endless hum. The flashing red and blue lights that had once illuminated the darkened street were gone, leaving only a heavy silence in their wake. The night was still again, but it was not the same night that Dina had begun walking home in. The world had shifted. The nightmare had passed, leaving exhaustion in its place. Dina's legs felt unsteady beneath her as the adrenaline began to wear off. The pain from her bruises and scrapes settled in, sharp and pulsing. But more than the physical pain, it was the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on her. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. Chuck Norris stood beside her, unmoving. His presence alone was enough to keep her grounded. Even though the immediate danger had passed, he remained alert, scanning the empty street, his sharp eyes missing nothing. His hands rested at his sides, relaxed but ready, always ready. Dina stole a glance at him, studying the calm strength in his face. He had done what no one else could. He had stepped in when no one else had. He had stopped the nightmare before it could get any worse. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Chuck shifted, turning toward her. "Let's go." Dina nodded, and without another word, they started walking. The streets felt different now. The same flickering streetlights still buzzed overhead, the same cracked pavement stretched beneath their feet, but Dina knew she would never look at this path the same way again. As they walked, Chuck's pace was steady, measured, but his attention never wavered. He kept her on the inside of the sidewalk, positioning himself between her and the road, as if even now he was shielding her from the world. The city was quieter at this hour. Storefronts had long since closed, and most of the foot traffic had thinned out. A few cars passed, their headlights cutting through the night, but otherwise, it was still. Dina glanced down at her hands. Her knuckles were raw, her fingertips trembling slightly. The reality of everything that had happened was starting to settle into her bones. The fear, the helplessness, the moment she had realized she was alone, trapped. Except, she hadn't been alone. Not for long. She clenched her hands into fists, trying to push away the lingering chill that crept up her spine. Chuck must have noticed the tension in her shoulders, because he finally broke the silence. "You're safe now." The words were simple, direct, but they carried a weight that settled deep inside her chest. She nodded, not trusting her voice just yet. They walked the rest of the way in silence. By the time they reached her house, the tension in her muscles had started to ease. The sight of the familiar porch, the warm glow from the living room window, the distant murmur of the television inside. It was all enough to remind her that she was home, safe. Chuck stepped up beside her as she reached for the front door. For a moment, she hesitated. The events of the night had left her rattled, and even though she was standing at her own doorstep, part of her still felt like she was trapped in that street, frozen under the weight of a nightmare. Sensing her hesitation, Chuck placed a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "Go inside, get cleaned up. I'll be right here." Dina swallowed hard, then nodded. She turned the handle and stepped inside. The warmth of the house enveloped her instantly. The familiar scent of home, wood polish, faint traces of dinner, a hint of fabric softener, wrapped around her like a safety net. It was such a stark contrast to the cold, unforgiving night she had just escaped. She didn't realize how much she had needed it. She barely made it to the hallway mirror before she stopped short, catching sight of her reflection. She looked different. Her hair was disheveled, strands falling messily around her face. Her clothes were torn, dust and dirt clinging to the fabric. The bruises were already forming, dark patches blooming across her skin like shadows. Her knees were scraped raw, dried blood crusting around the edges of the cuts. She barely recognized herself. For a moment, she just stood there, staring. Then, with a deep breath, she turned away. She went to the bathroom, washed her hands, cleaned the scrapes on her knees, the antiseptic stung. She changed into fresh clothes. The soft fabric was a stark relief against her bruised skin. The routine, the familiarity of it. It helped. It brought her back. By the time she stepped back into the living room, Chuck was still there. He was seated at the kitchen table now, his posture as relaxed as ever, but his eyes were watchful, always watchful. She hesitated, then slowly walked over and sat across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, Dina exhaled, "Thank you." Chuck met her gaze. He didn't nod, didn't say "you're welcome," didn't offer meaningless reassurances. He simply held her stare, his expression calm, steady, because he understood something didn't need to be said. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that existed between people who had been through something together, something that didn't need to be put into words. After a while, Chuck finally leaned back slightly. "You should rest." Dina nodded. She was exhausted. As she stood, Chuck rose too. He walked toward the door, pausing briefly before glancing back at her. "If you need anything," he said, "you call me." Dina swallowed. Then with more certainty than before, she nodded. He gave her one last look, then stepped outside. The night air rushed in for a brief moment before the door clicked shut behind him. Dina stood there for a long time, staring at the door. She knew she wouldn't sleep easily tonight. The memories of what had happened would linger in the corners of her mind, waiting for the darkness to settle in before creeping forward again. But she also knew something else. She wasn't alone. And as long as Chuck Norris was in this world, as long as he was watching, protecting, she never would be. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Dina sat in the silence of her living room, the aftermath of the night settling like dust. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a throbbing ache in her shoulder and a dull throb in her knee where the officer had pushed her. The events of the evening played on repeat in her mind. The officer's face, the chilling indifference in his eyes, the feel of his grip on her shoulder. She had felt so utterly helpless, so utterly alone, until he had arrived. The image of Chuck Norris striding into the scene, his presence radiating an aura of calm authority, filled her with a sense of disbelief, almost as if she had dreamed it. It was like a scene from a movie, a hero appearing just when the situation had seemed most hopeless. She replayed the moments in her mind, Chuck's swift, precise movements, the way he had neutralized the threat with effortless grace. He was like a force of nature, an unstoppable presence. And he had come to her rescue. She closed her eyes, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of vulnerability that had taken root in her. She ran her hand across her face, feeling the faint sting of the scrapes on her cheek. Dad, the name on her phone screen, the lifeline she had clutched in her moment of desperation, brought a sharp pang of guilt. She knew how worried he would be. She had told him she'd be home by a certain time. He would have been waiting up for her. But how would she explain this? She decided to call her father. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly, then hesitated. She had told him she would be home sooner. He would worry. But she needed to tell someone. She needed to hear his voice. And the thought of confiding in him, telling him about the officer's actions, the fear, and the relief. It brought a sudden warmth of relief that she could share her experiences. Taking a deep breath, she dialed his number. The phone rang 3 times before he answered, his voice instantly laced with concern. Dina? Honey, are you all right? Where are you? I was just about to call. Dad, I'm okay, she said, her voice wavering slightly. I'm home. There was a pause, a beat of silence. What happened? You sound. What's wrong? She closed her eyes, bracing herself. I was stopped by a police officer tonight. It was really bad. The line was silent for a moment, then a sharp intake of breath filled her ear. What? A police officer? What happened, Dina? His voice was tight, filled with immediate tension. She took a deep breath and began to tell him everything, recounting the encounter from start to finish. She described the officer's initial approach, the way he had dismissed her, how he had flicked her ID on the ground, the escalating aggression, the shove against the wall, the wrenching of her arm, the shove against the car, the phone call. She spared no details, her voice cracking with emotion as she relived the experience. As she spoke, she heard her father's breathing grow heavy. He interrupted her only to ask clarifying questions, his tone filled with growing anger. She could almost feel his outrage over the phone. When she mentioned Chuck's arrival and the swift resolution of the situation, her voice softened. And then he just showed up, Dad. Chuck Norris. And everything changed. He handled it. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then, her father let out a low whistle. Chuck Norris, he repeated, as if the name was impossible to process. Yes, Dad. Chuck Norris, she confirmed. He took care of everything. He made sure I was safe. Another long pause, and then, Dina, are you sure you're all right? There was a mix of disbelief and relief in his voice. Yes, Dad, I am. I needed to tell you. That, he paused. Then he took a slow breath. That is a lot to process. I know, she said, her voice weary. But I'm safe now, and it's over. What about this officer? Her father's voice returned to an edge. Do you know anything about him? Is he going to? He's been arrested, Dad. The captain took him into custody, she said. Chuck made sure of that. He was even the one who removed the officer's gun. Another pause. Then, her father's voice changed, softening. A deep, soothing note entered his words. Listen, Dina, you get some rest. I'm coming over. We need to talk about this. And we need to, well, we just need to be together. Okay, Dad. Relief flooded through her. She hadn't realized how much she longed to be comforted by his presence. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Don't you worry about a thing. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The apartment door creaked open, and Dina's father filled the doorway. He was a tall man, with a solid build, and a kind face etched with a network of laugh lines. His silver hair was combed back neatly, and his eyes were a warm, familiar hazel. Seeing him, the knot of tension that had been coiled tight in her chest began to loosen. He rushed towards her, and enveloped her in a tight hug. Oh, honey, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so glad you're okay. Dina buried her face in his shoulder, letting his warmth and strength seep into her. After a moment, he gently pushed her back, his eyes scanning her face, assessing her condition. Let me see you, he said, his voice filled with concern. She turned so that he could see her, and winced as he examined the scrapes on her knees and the forming bruises on her wrists. He gently touched her shoulder, probing the area around the point where the officer had grabbed her. She winced again. Does it hurt much? He asked, his voice laced with anger. Just a little sore, she said, trying to minimize the pain. It will be fine. He guided her to the couch, where she sat. He perched on the edge of a chair, his eyes never leaving her. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of the lamp, and a comforting silence settled between them. Tell me again, he said finally, his voice low and steady, from the beginning. She recounted the entire story again, from her exhaustion after school to the sudden appearance of Chuck Norris. She watched as her father's face hardened with each detail, his jaw clenching, his eyes narrowing with barely suppressed rage. She knew him well enough to understand the emotions playing across his features. The anger, the protectiveness, the fierce love he held for her. As she finished, a long silence fell between them, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Her father leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his silver hair, his expression unreadable. I can't believe this happened to you, he said finally, his voice tight. I don't understand. How could someone do this? He shook his head, the anger still evident in his voice. I don't know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He seemed to have a problem with me. I don't know why. He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. Well, he picked the wrong girl, that's for sure. And he messed with the wrong family. The last sentence hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Dina looked up at her father, a sudden wave of understanding washing over her. It wasn't just about the officer, or the abuse of power. It was about something more. Something that resonated with the silence in the apartment, something that had been kept under wraps for years. Dad, she asked, her voice tentative, hesitant. Is there something you're not telling me? Her father paused, his eyes flickered for a moment. He took a deep breath and finally said, You know, Dina, you know how I've always kept my past private. Dina nodded, her curiosity piqued. She had always known her father was a man of mystery. He was a man of deep integrity, who kept the past buried. He was the man who had been there for her when her mother passed away, the man who had kept a calm face, and the man who had been there for her through all life had thrown her way. He had always been the man she knew and loved, the man she knew everything about, and now he was a stranger to her. Well, he began, the truth is, before I was your dad. He hesitated, searching for the right words. I lived a different life. A life where I knew people. Dangerous people. And I used to be involved with some shady things. Dina's eyes widened in surprise. Her father was an accountant, a kind, gentle man who dedicated his life to helping others. She couldn't imagine him involved in anything illegal or dangerous. He continued, I'm not proud of it. I made some bad choices. But those choices, they made me who I am. And they made me want to make sure you lived a life that was safe, A life that would be free from what I had experienced. A shiver ran down Dina's spine. This was a revelation. This was a secret he had kept locked away for years. She stared at him, trying to reconcile this new information with a man she knew. But what does that have to do with what happened tonight? She asked. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and determination. Sometimes, the past can come back to haunt you. Sometimes, people from that past, they don't forget. They hold grudges. And sometimes, they're still watching. He paused, took a deep breath, and then said the words that would change everything. Your mother. She was involved in the same circles. She was he searched for a word and settled on a very important asset. And some people never forgot her either. Dina felt a wave of shock wash over her. Her mother, who had died when she was young, a woman she remembered for her warmth and kindness, was connected to her father's past? What had they been involved in? What could this all mean? What are you saying, Dad? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned forward, taking both of her hands in his. I'm saying that what happened tonight, it wasn't just random, Dina. It wasn't just a rogue cop. I think someone is sending a message. A warning. Dina felt a cold dread spread through her. A warning? What kind of warning? And what did it mean? Her father leaned closer, his gaze intense. I have to protect you, Dina. Always. And I have to figure out who is behind this. We are not safe. He paused, his eyes flickering with determination. And I know how to do it. I know people. I know how these things work. Another thought hit her, and she remembered what he'd said about knowing dangerous people in the past. Wait, Dad, she said, her voice laced with concern. Are you going to get involved? He looked at her, his expression softening, a flicker of a smile playing on his lips. Let's just say, he said, I know a few people who owe me some favors. He paused again and then said, the officer, Dina, that wasn't a coincidence. That wasn't a random stop. What are you saying? She asked, the room suddenly spinning around her. The officer, he said, his voice low and serious, he wasn't just a cop. He was hired. Dina's breath caught in her throat. Hired by whom? And why? Before she could speak, her phone rang. The ringtone, a simple, classical melody, cut through the heavy silence. Her father's eyes narrowed with concern. Dina reached for her phone, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at the screen, a name flashing in bold letters. Please subscribe my channel and share for more video.